Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. More importantly, I hope that in these times, these exceptional times, I hope wherever you are safe and sound. Today we have a fabulous panel with three outstanding speakers who wrote chapters in the Policy Center for the New South. Chapters in the 2020 Atlantic Current Reports, which is the 7th edition of the report. And we have three speakers, as I said, three outstanding speakers, including Dr. Fahad Alturki, who is Vice President and Head of Research at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. And then we have Dr. Arisen Ayadi, who is president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association and also professor at the Business School, City University of London. And then we have Ambassador Jose Gerardo Traslo. I'm very American in names, I butchered them, I am so sorry. Traslo Hernandez, who is currently the coordinator of the master's program in global studies at the Jenkins Graduate School, Universidad de las Americas Pueblo, and also professor of international economics. He also served as ambassador, of course, for Mexico in New Zealand, I believe in 2016, 2018, yes. And before that, he was the consul general de Mexico in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So we are going to go in alphabetical order, and I am going to ask Dr. Fahad Alturki to take over.
Thank you, Mina, for the nice introduction. And I would like to thank our colleagues at the Policy Center for the New South for inviting me to contribute to the chapter, as well as inviting me to speak about it today. I would like also to say Ramadan Mubarak for our colleagues, as Ramadan starts next week, inshallah. My discussion today will focus on what the implications of COVID-19 on the energy market. As you know, COVID-19 was first found in China at the end of 2019, and it was declared pandemic on March 11th. So we are just 1 month after the anniversary of this declaration, and many regions are still suffering from the lockdown and restrictions to combat the pandemic. Of course, every human activity has been modified, pushed everyone to live under what we now call the new norm. Slower economic activities have resulted also on lower energy demand. Importantly, decrease on energy used in transport sector, as well as in industry, has all been witnessed and experienced. In my 10 minutes, I will summarize the impact of on the energy market. In general, if we look at the global energy demand back in 2020, we see that it was declined by 5% on an annual basis as COVID-19 lockdown and confinement measures were enforced around the globe. This is in fact the largest decline in 70 years. The IEA estimates that global coal consumption fell by 4% last year, which is the steepest decline since World War II. But the decline in coal was concentrated mostly in the early months of last year, especially in Asia, which by end of 2020, demand surged again, in particular also in Asia. We have in KAPSARC a model that predicts the dynamics of the market, and according to our estimates last year in oil market, oil demand fell by 8% compared to 2019. Consumption of oil in the transport sector has been the most affected, but also industrial and other uses experienced a significant drop as well. On the gas side, demand fell by an estimate of 2.5%, which is also the largest drop on record. Gas demand for power generation remained resilient owing to fuel switching, while the whole supply chain showed strong flexibility in adjusting to demand variation. Um, on the nuclear power, according to the IEA, nuclear generation was down by 3.5% in the first quarter of 2020, compared with the same period of the previous year. It's pulled down by reduction in electricity demand in most markets as consequences of the pandemic, as well as fewer reactors being in operation. Um, but on the flip side, on a sharp contrast to all other fuels, renewable used for generating electricity grew by almost 7% last year, which is a positive sign if we want to look at the half full of the implications of COVID-19 on the energy sector. Looking forward, according to our estimate, oil market demand will only reach a pre-pandemic level only in the second half of 2022. Even with such a prediction, there is a great level of uncertainty depending on the path of recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, including how quickly containment measures are lifted or worst reinforced, and also the pace of the economic recovery. So great level of uncertainty on how things are going to recover. On the supply side for the oil market, producer, following the May event of last year when oil prices almost collapsed, in fact, the producer managed to adjust their production afterward according to the demand dynamics. But they still need to remain prudent, even if oil prices are now at a reasonable level. The market still need to find a proper balance between supply and demand. And in fact, inventory will remain high for a while. On the gas side, natural gas definitely performed better than oil or coal in the wake of the pandemic. However, the global gas market has experienced its largest demand shock on record. This is mainly because of the pandemic, but also it was partly because of the market was weakened following a 2019 slowdown in demand and very mild winter last year. In the beginning, supply did not adjust to the drop in consumption, underestimating the implications of COVID-19, which resulted in a considerable buildup in storage. But it adjusted slowly during the year, reaching a balance between supply and demand toward the end of last year. The adjustment in supply and unexpected gradual recovery in demand, taking advantage of prices, is likely to bring in some relief in 2021 for the gas market. However, again, as I mentioned, for the oil market and gas market will also depend on how the economies and activities will recover from COVID-19, and many things remain to be seen. Even with the vaccination, we're seeing that global economic activities are not picking up as much as it's supposed to be. In terms of the market transition and the power sector, global electricity demand also witnessed a significant reduction due to the pandemic, falling by 2.5% in the first quarter of last year. This accelerated into the second quarter as the pandemic spread around the world. And at the end of the year, there was a third wave of infections, and also a fourth wave has emerged, which also pushed the market downward. Despite the drop in electricity demand, renewable power additions are the only source of energy defying the COVID-19 and setting a new record, growing by nearly 4% globally in 2020. Lower energy consumption has resulted in clearer skies, recording one of the only few positive effects of COVID-19 pandemic. However, the current situation is not a lasting solution and remains to be a temporary solution, and a need for a permanent approach to climate change and air pollution remain to be needed globally. Um, in fact, a more integrated, inclusive, and holistic approach is needed to help countries transition toward the climate-friendly energy system that supports and enables sustainable development. Here at KAPSARC, we have developed the concept or the framework of the circular carbon economy, which has been approved by or endorsed by the G20 leaders last year. It will help enable countries, particularly the Greater South, to manage carbon emissions while enabling their sustainable development by taking advantage of all technologies, form of energies, and mitigation opportunities according to the availability of resources, economic conditions, and national circumstances. We can elaborate on this in the discussion as well. In conclusion, I would say with COVID-19 have caused the largest demand shock in the energy market since World War II, impacting both the physical demand, investments, as well as policy directions within the energy sector. This has caused a major shift within the global energy mix and raised the probability of shortage or even price spikes if things rebound rapidly. Significant decrease in oil investments is generating a serious concern among experts, and there is now an emerging analysis of a super cycle coming soon within the energy market, and in particular the oil market. There is, I would like to conclude with by saying that we are definitely not out of the current situation. Likely the level of uncertainty will remain in this year, but global cooperation is needed if we want to reduce the volatility in the market and improve the outlook as well as support growth. I'll stop here and back to you, Maya.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fahad Alturki, for this great presentation. And I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions at the end about this intervention. We move on now to Dr. Reem Ayadi, who will be talking about the debt situation amidst COVID-19 and important issues that are related to it. The floor is yours, Dr. Ayadi.
Thank you very much, Nina, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me for this launch of the Atlantic Current for this 2020, I think 2020, yes. So my comments, as you rightly said, will tackle one important aspect, which is the increasing debt, sovereign debt in the middle and low-income countries, and also the current efforts of the international community to respond collectively during the global pandemic. And also I'll share with you some proposals we made at the G20, T20 task force on international financial architecture last year about the debt transparency issue, which is now becoming a core issue to solve, among, of course, other issues, to solve the debt crisis that we are heading to. So looking at the ongoing development, which in reality started much before the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused widespread further concern about the debt and sustainability in both developed and also emerging economies, and obviously particularly in economies that are low and middle income. So if you look at the data by the IMF, which was published practically last year before the winter events of the IMF. So we are looking at really debt ratios that are projected to rise for more than 20% of GDP in advanced economies and more than 10% of GDP in emerging economies and about 7% in low-income countries. And this is as compared to very high level already in 2019. And I believe that because of the uncertainty of COVID and dealing with it, these levels will go even further for 2021 and 2022. So we're moving into really what I call a movement of debt overhang. And this is really very dangerous for economic growth and economic recovery, particularly if certain countries are incapable of servicing their debt. Now, if we look at the situation of the advanced economies, which have the capacity to borrow because they have much lower interest rate and risk premia, emerging economies and low-income countries, they face much tighter limits on their ability to carry additional debt. Why? Because their risk premium is much higher, and also some of the countries are already entering into a debt or debt default spiral. Like, for example, take the case of Zambia, or, as you know, the case of Argentina and others. Now, last year, the IMF has called for an urgent need to reform the international debt architecture, which in reality is being debated at different levels, including the G20 level this year in Italy. And that call is very important because practically it is calling for more debt relief. So the expectation would be that we will see a spiral of default, which will increase global vulnerabilities in the financial markets, and also the expectations of the investors who will have to start, thinking about their portfolios and how to deal with it, and specifically in certain countries that are needing this debt. The second point of the reform was to strengthen the contractor provisions via the extension of collective action clauses to non-bonded debt, enhanced by clauses that lower debt payment or automatically suspend debt services, such as, for example, the event of natural catastrophes and other large economic shocks. So this is also important because we're moving into different type of dealings with this debt. And third, it's to enhance debt transparency to facilitate the restructuring and resolution of decisions and actions. And I think for me, the key point of this reform is the transparency, because in reality, if we look at the sovereign debt, the data is scattered, and there are many debt by countries that are borrowing, for example, from countries like China or others who do not disclose what they are borrowing. This is quite dangerous because no one knows what is really the incidence of the debt of certain countries that are borrowing from those type of from other emerging countries. If we look, for example, at what we are finding in terms of the data, I mean, the World Bank has recently, actually a few months ago, published some historical debt data, which is very interesting. I think it sheds some light on what is the situation of certain countries. And I think Nowadays, it's quite accessible via online links and so on. But it was very interesting to see another study which was published just in March, which was diving into 100 debt contracts between China and foreign governments. And the interesting part is that there is a clear confidentiality clause requiring many debtors in different countries not to disclose the terms of the contract. And I think, as I mentioned, this is very important to go beyond, to have a much better view on what's going on in the debt market, particularly between countries. Now, to address, as I mentioned, the debt challenge during the pandemic, in 2020, the G20 initiated the debt restructuring initiative called as the DSSI, which in fact was extended not a few days ago up to the end of the year. And now there is there are many calls to extend this debt relief to many other countries who are experiencing difficulties to pay their debt. Another debate, which is part of the whole dynamic at the moment, is also the participation of the private sector creditors for the debt relief efforts, which those private creditors, so it's normally market creditors, they have been quite reluctant to participate massively to this debt relief. And I think one of the key elements that they were debating was the debt transparency, because I do not have really a clarity on what is there on the books of certain countries, then to be able to contribute to the effort of debt relief. Now, they have, majority of them, I mean, I'm speaking about the private creditors via their institution of International Institute of Finance, they have committed to the voluntary principles of debt transparency, which was approved in 2019, knowing that this is not really an altruistic measure, but rather a cornerstone for more sustainable investment and underwriting environment in the market. So keeping the terms of the loans under confidentiality clauses, for example, by certain countries, very much hinders credit market liquidity and efficient allocation of capital and pricing. This is an important element which should be carefully assessed over time, and then a solution has to be made on this element, perhaps by the G20 in Italy. Now, beyond the practicality, of course, of debt restructuring, debt transparency is a matter, again, of central importance, and it's also very important for governance, public governance, debt sustainability, and then also recovery from the pandemic. And of course, without saying that this is important for debt accountability and incentive alignments overall in the market and the public sector. Back then, we have made a proposal that was last year, is to implement what I call a global mechanism to record old and new sovereign debt issues to boost global debt transparency. And I think this, what I call the global repository, should be updated very quickly in real time. Also being enhanced by data analysis techniques to allow to better understanding the implications of this accumulation of debt on risk, systemic risk overall, but also to understand what is the capacity of certain countries to service its debt on time without going into the default spiral. And I understand also that the OECD, for the moment, is working on such a platform in collaboration with the private sector and with discussion with the G20 currently. So this is a very good development in the right direction. And obviously, this will enhance the knowledge about this debt, sovereign debt accumulation, and then understanding, or better understanding, what are the factors of its sustainability to ensure that we are not going further into a major debt crisis going forward. Thank you very much. These are my comments, and I remain open to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ayadi. Very interesting questions indeed and topics. And I'm sure that we're going to come back to many of them during the discussion. We are going to move on now to Ambassador Jose Gerardo Traslers Hernandez, who will be talking to us about COVID-19 and the Great Lockdown.
Yes, thank you, Mina, so much. And thank you to the Policy Center for the New South on behalf of COMEXI, of which I am a member, and which was the center that put me in contact with the Policy Center. No, I really thank you for this wonderful opportunity, and also for being with you, Mina, and such wonderful speakers. I'd like to just clarify that I am attached to these institutions, but the opinions expressed here are mine and not necessarily those of these institutions. Things have changed, definitely, since I wrote the chapter. For example, there were no vaccines then, okay, and that's been a huge change. But nonetheless, I think that lots of the things that I said at the time remain quite valid, except that others have accelerated. But I'd like to talk about, first, make a few general considerations, then speak about critical opinions that have been made by some key actors, and speak a little bit about Latin America and Mexico, challenges and opportunities of the COVID-19, and a few final thoughts, okay? Well, the world is facing an unprecedented twin health and economic crisis caused by COVID-19 or new coronavirus, worsening income and wealth inequality and increasing debt accumulation, as was just said, confronting the world with a recession not seen since the Great Depression of the late 20s and 1930s. COVID-19 should be a prelude to could be a prelude to subsequent episodes of even greater global instability caused by climate change, and it is an important wake-up call to take preventive action against possible future calamities. UN reports have estimated that at least 100 million people have fallen into extreme poverty around the world because of the pandemic. Global capitalism is surely in danger since the pandemic has forced numerous firms to close, increasing unemployment to unprecedented levels as economic agents fail to repay their debts, as just was said. Because of the lack of income, the burden is transferred to the financial sector. If the current crisis becomes a financial one, then the worst could still be yet to come. Fortunately, over the recent past, vaccines have been approved and made available initially to vaccine-generating countries, mostly the US, the UK, Russia, and China, although still at an experimental level due to the emergency. This month, the IMF estimated, just yesterday, this chart was released. The IMF estimated that for year 2000, that for year 2020, the fall in world output was minus 3.3%, with advanced economies falling minus 4.7%, emerging and developing economies falling by minus 2.2%. China grew 2.3%, India fell by minus 8%, South Africa fell by minus 7%. Latin America was, as a region, the worst performing, falling minus 7%, with Mexico falling minus 8.5% according to official Mexican figures, minus 8.2% according to this chart right here. Mexico is being one of the worst performers of the world. Next year, this year, the world is expected to rebound strongly at 6%, but many uncertainties prevail. Widespread vaccination will be key to recovery. highlighting the close relation that exists between health and the economy. The world is bound to enter a third wave of COVID-19 infections, with vaccinations lagging in production and distribution, while populations have become tired of confinement. New strains of the virus are coming from South Africa, Brazil, the UK, and others, bringing the world back into confinement and ruining perhaps the expectations of a strong recovery this year. Governments have intervened to rescue their economies, supporting private enterprises by postponing tax collection and providing subsidies to families and firms, thereby increasing their deficits while providing liquidity to the banking system through the central banks as needed. Letting firms fail would create more unemployment and poverty and would make the recovery more difficult. Massive programs have been implemented to lift the economy and preserve formal employment in the face of the pandemic in most nations, in particularly the US and the EU. Reconstruction of the economy could take years, with many industries contracting and others expanding. Industries related to healthcare, the environment, and to new technologies in telecom, automation, artificial intelligence are most likely to expand, while sectors that require large crowds to operate will be the biggest losers from the pandemic, such as recreational and hospitality activities, traditional commerce, and mass transportation. Agriculture, mining, and manufacturing in general, wherever safety protocols can be applied, such as the use of face masks, safe distancing, and hand washing, should not suffer as much. The problem to solve in the present crisis is to minimize the loss of life while minimizing at the same time the economic cost of the pandemic. Both objectives need to be pursued at the same time. The pandemic destroys lives, while the needed lockdown to contain the pandemic destroys economies. There is a very close relationship between good health and good economies, and one cannot exist without the other. Staying at home, away from work, is a luxury that only those with sufficient savings can afford. The loss of employment and income for people living in poverty could lead to famine, more disease, and social anarchy, creating even more uncertainty. The lack of proper statistics, particularly in the developing world, is an important problem that needs to be addressed to know the real magnitude of the pandemic. Excess deaths over trend are an indicator of the gravity of the pandemic. In Mexico, there are 2.5 times over the official count, according to some estimates, bringing total deaths close to 500,000 people, 2.5 times above the official number. Governments of the world have been providing fiscal, monetary, and credit stimulus. But the result will entail significant debt accumulation, as was said by RIM, to lessen the economic impact in the short term. This will make it difficult for developing countries to recover in the future as they seek to repay their higher debt, unless a rescue operation is implemented by international organizations and major world governments. The alternative is to deepen the health and economic crisis in the short term without support from governments, or make the recovery very difficult in the future. Most governments have decided to support their populations, preferring to address the short-term difficulties, thus paying debts at a later stage. The Mexican government decided not to support private firms, arguing that it preferred to provide resources directly to the poor under politically and electorally biased social programs. This is a key reason why Mexico faced one of the worst crises in Latin America and the world in 2020. Mexico's closeness with the United States, which is implementing a massive economic rescue program and vaccination operation, will help Mexico to recover quicker. In Mexico, the pandemic arrived at a particularly difficult time. The country had just entered a recession in 2019 under the populist policies of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO. Private investors were scared off with the cancellation of a major airport in Mexico City. The AMLO government dropped the health insurance systems in place for people living in poverty, replacing that with an improvised system called the INSABI. According to the OECD, our greatest intergenerational responsibility is climate change. As economies get rebuilt, the world should combat environmental degradation and keep its biodiversity. It is essential to transform consumption patterns to be compatible with health and the environment. According to the World Economic Forum, systemic inequalities emerged with COVID-19. These included access to healthcare, green space, safe distancing, the internet, connectivity, the ability to work remotely, and information. Renowned French thinker Jacques Attali suggested that the economy will be reoriented towards life industries such as health, hygiene, better food, clean energy, education, medicine, resources, digital, and security. While empathy and altruism should be encouraged. Bill Gates noted that inequalities have exacerbated the pandemic everywhere, hitting lower income communities disproportionately in the United States, mainly Afro-Americans and Latin populations, and in the world. He indicated that the world was not prepared for the pandemic and that it has cost trillions of dollars while it would have cost a lot less, about 1% of the actual cost, if we had been prepared. The World Economic Forum has issued the following alerts about risks and opportunities in the post-COVID-19 world. The world may end up being more divided, more nationalistic, and more conflicted. To avoid that, cooperation must be strengthened to come out of the crisis quickly and peacefully. Closing trade will damage everyone. Research cooperation is required to prevent future outbreaks. There will be an acceleration towards automation and artificial intelligence. Digital connectivity and renewable energy sources are key. There will be more online shopping, fewer department stores, fewer shopping malls, and more green spaces. Online distribution of goods and services will increase. Just-in-time approaches will be modified to avoid disruption. There will be a greater awareness of nature, new pandemics, and climate change. Humanity should evolve towards a truly digital and global society aided by 5G networks. Well, a few conclusions. As a result of the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis, the world may end up being a much more divided and nationalistic place. Efforts should be made to strengthen international cooperation to come out of the crisis quickly and peacefully. Closing trade to prevent supplies of medical equipment to other countries or even the hoarding of excessive amounts of machines will be to the detriment of all. Globalization will not end, but will very likely take a different course because of COVID-19. As the efficiency and comparative or competitive advantage criteria will remain. But the precautionary principle, the environment, and social responsibility criteria will be equally relevant in decision-making, hopefully. Production value chains will be relocated closer to consumption centers. There is an explosive cocktail in the world, rising nationalism, a pandemic, and great recession. Globalization accentuated the divide between the haves and the have-nots, leaving the poor more vulnerable to the pandemic. This should be readdressed. Hopefully, the vaccines will be distributed soon to the whole world, but the more time it takes, the economic, social, and political consequences will be greater. Democratic forces will have to mobilize against the demagogues and intolerant on both the right and left, who might want to take the opportunity to impose their agenda. The global digital society will accelerate, but the digital divide will deepen as large sectors of society remain without access to the internet in the developing world. Greater investment will be required in prevention to deal with global emergencies, including climate change. The main risk of the pandemic is the collapse of economies and social chaos. The main opportunity is to create a much more crisis-resistant world. COVID-19 is a wake-up call that the world cannot ignore. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gerardo. And I think you touched upon this. Actually, you did answer one question that you received from the audience, but I'm gonna repeat it anyway. The question says, do you think the vaccine will be available for everyone in the world, especially poor countries? And the question is to you, Gerardo, since you touched upon this.
Yes, but not that quickly. Okay, I've seen some estimates that perhaps by next year, Of course, the U.S. is acting as, you know, when you are in the airplane and they tell you if something happens, and the oxygen mask fall, not just do it for yourself and then help the others. Okay, that's exactly what is happening with the United States, with the UK, with Europe, not so much with China and Russia, because China and Russia are using the vaccines for diplomatic purposes. Okay, to gain political space, particularly for the developing world. Okay, so it will take a little bit of time. There is a race. There's an important diplomatic race between the United States, the Europeans, okay, and China and Russia to gain space and influence with the developing world. Those who stand to help the developing world better, okay, will win space, and will win political standing. Okay, and that is a very important element that also will be a game changer.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting how, like, when there is a disaster in a continent or an area, we all pull together and try to help. But pandemics, because they are hitting everybody, they actually, at least initially, they lead to the opposite. Lockdown, everybody is so mistrustful of the neighboring country, and you don't want to cooperate and all these things, even though during these circumstances, it is global cooperation that might save humanity. But it is an interest, it's a...
I have a comment there, okay? Just like within a country, a region that is contaminated or that has the virus is a risk for the rest of the country.
Yes, yes.
And a country is a risk for the rest of the nations.
Exactly.
So we need all to cooperate, okay?
Yeah.
Because if we don't cooperate, then we will not be able to get rid of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. And I have a couple of questions for Dr. Fahad. It's actually more like just trying to inquire about things. We are talking now about a fourth wave of the pandemic that's already started in some European countries. I don't know if everybody has heard about this, but many of them now are putting more restrictions. Even in Morocco, there is now a curfew during Ramadan that's being instituted, I understand. So the oil-producing countries, if this happens, it's going to be disastrous for them. So are they, like right now, are they coming up with measures to just alleviate the pain if this happens in the future?
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a very good questions and valid question, I guess. We've seen how the pandemic, if it left alone without market management, what will happen to the energy market? Last April, just 1 month after the World Health Organization declared this as a pandemic, there was a market collapse in April where major producers in the world decided to act in their own interest, raising production, and oil prices collapsed in April of last year. Major drop in oil prices to the negative territory. And then at the end of the month, there was a meeting including players who even outside OPEC plus decided that the market stability over the short term is important to ensure sustainability of the market over the longer term, because very, very low oil prices will deter investments in the sector and will risk a major spike in oil prices over the longer term. And since then, even at the G20 level last year, there were a task force that was formed to take care to discuss market volatility in response to COVID-19 and coordinate efforts to make sure that the market responds to the crisis. Now, fast forward to the summer, the second wave, and so on, and so on. The oil-producing countries have reduced their level of production to maintain reasonable prices that will encourage investments in the sector. But when economic activity start picking up, last meeting earlier last week, there was an announcement that production will be increased in the market to support the emerging signs of recovery as a result of the vaccination. But again, to your point, if market goes back and respond to wave 4, and if we see a major ramifications on the market, then I would assume that the oil-producing countries will try to balance the market. Now, the market remains the inventories remain above their 5-year average in developing or developed countries. And that's a good sign. So that's for the economic recovery is supported with stronger fundamental from the energy sector.
Thank you. And then the second question, which came to us from the audience, is what effect will COVID-19 have on the international strategy to tackle climate change?
I think that's I think an important question over the long term, and I think if we look at the impact of economic activity in general on climate change and vis-a-vis the targets under Paris Agreement, it will be very challenging to see these targets achieved by the mid-century or even the second half. There has to be a major level of collaboration and cooperation across countries to reduce emissions. Of course, such reduction will have a major impact on economic activities, especially for the developing countries. And that's why in Saudi Arabia, under T20 last year, we introduced the concept of the circular carbon economy to manage the emissions. So rather than focusing on the mitigation factors, we introduced this concept to adapt to the climate change, find solutions, as well as address the issues related to the economy and economic development. The concept of the circular carbon economy builds on the circular economy concept, which is based on reuse, recycle, and reduce. The circular carbon economy adds a fourth R, which is remove. And the concept or the framework accepts all technologies, all options, while addressing countries' circumstances to manage emissions. And this concept or this framework most likely will reduce the implications of climate change targets on economic activity, especially in developing countries.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on back to Reem with a question, and I very much appreciate the valuable insights in your intervention. I like that repository that you're going to have where there is more information about the debt that's given or contracted with the developing countries or low-income countries. One of the issues that sometimes people raise, and maybe governments in some countries raise, is the fact that that international debt has of course, a political economy aspect to it, and that some details, if they are put out there, they might trigger political instability in the country, instability, social unrest, and things like that. So, as you said, set the guidelines for the repository. Are you going to be looking for specific information and also taking into account the fact that some type of information might lead to disaster in terms of social and political unrest in the countries?
Thank you, Mina, for this question. In my view, transparency should not be constrained. I think what is important is the timing of the disclosure of the information. So the timing should be well studied. And in fact, if we allow aspects which feed opaqueness on the debt dealings of certain countries, then for me, at least this is my opinion, this is a recipe for disaster, because if we do not know, and one day we know, then it becomes a big scandal. And the impact will be much higher than when we know at the right point in time, and then we can manage the known, even if it was unknown. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is transparency should not be constrained, bounded. It must be open. And then the idea of a global repository, and I think this initiative is spearheaded in reality by the private sector, particularly when the private sector is engaging with certain countries and then through the bond market. The bond market is generally transparent. Now the bilateral loan agreements are much less transparent, and it should be transparent on time. Sometimes they are transparent later on after, I don't know, 10 years, but that's too late. I think you need to have the data disclosed to not only to the market to price well, but also to better understand the risk factors within certain countries and their capacity to service their debt. And also the level of accumulation of debt, it means that the debt burden that they have. So sometimes when you have a debt burden which is unsustainable, then it's better to find other ways and then see how you can deal with the burden. And then or maybe even you can engage in debt relief mechanisms which are structured. And this is why the IMF is rethinking the overall design of its debt architecture. But again, the key issue here, and I mentioned it, and I really invite you all to read this report, which was published, I think, 1 week ago, about studying 100 loan contracts provided by China to certain countries, and where the clauses of confidentiality not to allow the borrowers to disclose the terms of the loan. I think this is really detrimental for overall financial stability and also debt sustainability at a global level.
Thank you very much. I personally, I completely agree with you. I was just raising a point that people, when we make the same, statements, people would say, oh, yeah, but it's kind of. No, I do, however, think of that the issues raised about China. Just to be fair, there are many loans in the past that happened, for example, between, I'm not going to pick on any country, but some European countries and African countries. The complete details are not, or is it that when the Europeans contract with issue loans, did they have to say everything? I know that now there are rules, but I'm talking about like 20, 30 years ago. Not that I'm trying to find a justification for what China is doing. What I'm trying to say is that we have to treat everybody equal. That's my principle. Anyway, now what about the private lenders or private creditors? There are things that we might be able to impose on that countries, because they are nation states, they have to abide with, since it's everybody, coming together and saying you have to do this and that. Will this have the same weight vis-a-vis the private creditors. And I know that you work through that Institute of Finance, I think International Corporation of Finance or International Institute of Finance. But would this have the same, would they have to fulfill the same obligations?
I don't know if there are obligations, Mina. I think there are some voluntary principles for debt transparency. And these were more or less like as a code of conduct by all the private creditors. I mean, for sure, not all of them are agreeing to abide to this code of conduct, but then the majority do, specifically the ones that would like to manage the risk profiles and also enhance the quality of the underwriting processes. Obviously, there are others that are not interested. I mean, because you see, I mean, if you are a group of different creditors, not everybody, you know, follows the same. So some of them, they might not. But then in my view, it's a dynamic, it's a process. And then with time, you know, there are the ones that are leading the group, and then the followers at one day, they will have to follow. Otherwise, they will have to explain why they don't want to follow.
Thank you. Well, I worked for some time, I worked on foreign aid. And I always thought that if we had obligation instead of just you may do this and it's nice to do this, aid would have been a lot more effective today. So when you said it's just a code of conduct, we know about how much people or like humanity respects all together, respects the codes of conduct. You have people who follow things to the letter, but you have others who just shrug it off and say, you know, I mean, whatever happens, happens. So I think if we're going to do it, for it to be successful, it should be like the rules we have in some countries. Like in the US, we have disclosure rules for corporations, and they have to disclose those things, right? That's why our financial markets are thriving, because we have those rules. So if this is going to be successful, it should be a bunch of rules, and this is, again, why I asked what sort of guidelines or what sort of things will be put in. The community that's working on this, including yourself, they should really come up with certain things that are feasible and that are not going to jeopardize the sovereignty of any nation, and then say, okay, this is the list, and you have to do it no matter what. This is not really a code of conduct, it's an obligation if you're going to contract a loan, either as creditor or borrower.
For the moment, as I mentioned, the debt transparency principles is a code of conduct, and it was approved in 2019, so only a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. So of course, this is the first step. Now, to have a rule, yes, you can, but then the rules are country-based or regional-based. In the European Union, within the EU, you can impose a rule, for example, on banks, not to allow banks to get involved. For example, I mean, I'm just giving one example, not to allow banks to enter into any sovereign debt transactions unless everything is disclosed on the public repository, okay? Now, if they don't do it, then this will be an impact on their capital requirements, okay? So then there is an incentive for them to really abide to the rule, but not directly, you know, imposing a certain way of doing it. So practically, it will cost them much more if they contract or they engage in untransparent, opaque transactions. Now, not only from a capital perspective, so capital requirement perspective, but also from a reputational perspective and a conduct risk perspective, okay? And this will enhance, you know, what I call, you know, the eyes on them, you know, and all of these things that you know, the issues that everybody knows nowadays. I mean, there are many scandals in the market, which in reality, you don't want to be part of that. So, so for me, you could impose, but then again, it's not only about imposition, it's also the right incentives. You provide the right incentives to the market. And what is this right incentive? It's basically, if you have a transparent debt or contract, then the price is lower. I mean, the price normally of the bond is higher, but then the yield is lower. So the probability of default would be lower. And then the recovery rate on the overall debt is higher. And this is important for this type of So the more information you have, the less asymmetry of information you have, and the more you have the capability to return your debt, and also the countries to repay back based on their capacities to repay back. And then another thing, it's also, if you know the real situation, then some of the creditors may not jump in queue to, to overlend you, because then they know very well that you don't have the capacity to borrow and to pay back unless they want to engage in this type of debt. So it's I think it's a matter of incentive, and in my view, transparency is essential to reduce the asymmetry of information and then to enhance accountability overall, because these are public debt and the citizens have to be aware and they have to approve it as well.
Indeed, incentives are very important. Thank you so much. This has been great, and I very much thank you. And I just realized that at the start of our talk, I did not introduce myself, not because I think that I am so global that everybody in the world knows me, no, although I am definitely a global citizen. I just was so happy to introduce the panelists, and I forgot. So I am Mina Baria Mulutz. I'm Richard Durham's Professor of Economics at the University of North Florida and also a senior fellow at PCNS. And I thank you very much. But before I close, I must ask the panelists also if they have questions or comments to each other. We have a few minutes. Gerardo, nothing? You are muted, sorry.
I was very impressed by the presentations that were just made. I think Reem just gave us a great lecture on public and private lending and the risks that are associated to it. And also we have a concern about climate change, of course. And Mr. Alturki, of course, coming from the oil industry, might have some what do you see is going to happen, Mr. Fahad? Is it going to be that the targets of the Paris Agreement will not be met? How is the industry going to evolve? I have seen some major oil industry already switching, okay, from carbon-based production to clean energy production, okay? And I also see that the price of technology of new energies keeps going down. So that I think that's the main challenge that now the oil industry faces is coming from competition, okay? Competition. And could you elaborate on this, please?
Very, very good point. That's, I think, the shift that you talk about is evident, and we see it in the data. The only sector in the energy sphere that is growing is the renewable energy under COVID-19. So there is a growth. There are investments coming into the renewable landscape, which will help in achieving the Paris targets, Paris Agreement targets. But I would say still the cost is high, especially on developing countries. There is an energy poverty in many parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa, that needs to be addressed without the high cost of the renewable. To produce a solution that will address this concern, we need to think out of the box on, rather than focusing on mitigation, we can also focus on adaptation and managing managing the carbon and managing the emission. And that's where the concept of the circular carbon economy evolved on. You mentioned energy efficiency, and that is part of the reduced part of the circular carbon economy. The reuse is to capture the carbon through innovative technologies, and there are some technologies that are being developed in certain countries, in advanced economies, as well as here in the kingdom, that can be used. The carbon can be used for useful products or injected back into the oil and gas reservoirs to increase productivity in the sector. Also, the recycle. So CO2 is chemically transformed into a new product, such as fertilizers or cement or other forms of energy, such as synthetic fuels. And last but not least is the remove. And the remove for carbon is to remove the carbon from atmosphere, which can be both in positive in terms of achieving the goals of target Paris agreements, while at the same time reducing the implications or the high cost of the renewable on the developing economies. So we are shifting away from considering carbon as from an enemy or a challenge to making it an asset that can be utilized through the 4 R's of the circular carbon economy.
Oh, thank you. Can I ask another question?
Sure. Go ahead.
A question to Rim about the. I don't know if you can tell us about the behavior of the stock markets. I mean, after a sharp initial drop, they just went crazy, no? And the U.S. stock markets are now way above the pre-pandemic levels. Okay, and I understand that the European markets just reached the pre-pandemic levels. Okay, and there's still uncertainties. Okay, as to whether there will be a sound recovery coming ahead. I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about that.
It's a difficult question for me, this one. I mean, the stock market is we call it, it's a concept of I would call it a continuous exuberance. I do not know whether it is following the theories, which even the theories are not functioning anymore, financial theories, in the stock market, or it's really the expectations of the investors, which are really collecting a lot of information on certain trends, not by themselves, because before you used to do it with your hands or with the computers, but nowadays it's with the massive data analytics, and this is also helping in a way. I mean, maybe not explaining, the underlying movements in the real economy. So for me, I mean, at the beginning, I always thought the stock market could give more or less a real information about what's going on in the underlying economy. But nowadays, specifically with very high uncertainty and volatility, and it's very difficult to understand how the market is moving overall. Practically, there are some pockets in the market which are very easily moved, either, for example, by data analytics or by certain, trends or certain, I would say, forces within the market, which they know exactly where the trends are going. But overall, in my view, it's very difficult nowadays to predict how the stock market is going and how it reacts. For example, I mean, I would have expected much worse situations with the pandemic, but it's not happening. I mean, even you look at the volatility indexes, they are moving completely on the opposite trend, which is very strange too. So I think more research on this has to be done and to better understand really what is driving the stock market. But also there is another thing which I want to add, the massive liquidity injections that have been put by the governments might also explain such trends. And I think for me, there is a clear embedded moral hazard which is happening, even in the bond market. I mean, there is really the risk, it's not priced in an appropriate way. So this is my explanation, but I mean, more research needs to be done on that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, great insights. And in terms of the industries doing bad, it's not everybody is doing bad. I mean, Amazon, for example, and shipping industries and everything that's related to IT was huge boom for them. I mean, we're using Zoom. Who would have talked about Zoom like 2-3 years ago, right? There was no Zoom. Anyway, excellent. Fahad, any questions? No? Okay. So this was so fascinating. We should have scheduled even 2 hours or more, but I hope that in the future we're going to come back to some of these topics and then have this panel again address them. And we are going to close. And so to our audiences around the world, be safe and be kind to each other. Thank you.